That's great. So welcome in today, everyone who's joining us. It is now 4:31, so I'm gonna have to roll with this thing. I'm Dr. James Gilley. I am an assistant professor of political science at Nicholls State University in beautiful Thibodaux, Louisiana. And I'm here today to speak to you about the Artemis Accord and Martian constitutions. So presentation mode. All right. So again, welcome aboard. I'm really glad to have you all here today. If you do want to participate and have questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end of this presentation. So today I'm here to speak with you about the recently signed Artemis Accords, the still relatively recently proposed Artemis Accords, and how those might impact the idea of a Martian constitution or constitutions. That's something we can talk about along the way. So let's go ahead and just dive right in on this. So what are the Artemis Accords? Now, for those of you that just came in from the other Artemis Accords presentation, you've probably gotten plenty of this already. But for those of you that have been here with me, the Artemis Accords are 10 points, 10 new ideas meant to build on top of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 framework, right? I call it the framework because there's actually several treaties that have built up what we largely think of as international space law. But what the Artemis Accords are meant to do is to actually create a future legal regime that actually allows us to work around a couple of the principles of Article 2, well, of the Outer Space Treaty, in particular Article 2, which is the one that makes it difficult to use space resources. Specifically, Article 2 says that there can be no claims or appropriation of use and utilization of resources in space, right? So that basically rules out in situ resource utilization, which is the only way that a Martian civilization is ever going to happen. A Martian instance of humanity is ever going to happen. So the Artemis Accords seeks to, not manipulate, but to elucidate and change and modify this situation. And it does this through allowing for the utilization of space resources, although it says within the guises of the Outer Space Treaty. And it focuses on de-escalation of security threats, both in and through outer space. And we're going to get into that just a little bit more. So what the Artemis Accords does, it puts forth 10 principles for human space activities. Now, they cannot stand on their own. They are predicated on Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and the other body of space law in order to more fully give us a legal picture of what we can and can't do in outer space. So just briefly, the 10 principles are peaceful purposes, right? You're supposed to go into space with peaceful purposes. You're supposed to be transparent with your operations. There should be interoperability of space technologies. Emergency assistance should be rendered. You're supposed to register your space objects. You're supposed to release your scientific data. You're supposed to protect the heritage of outer space. We'll get into that in the next slide. That allows for the utilization of space resources. It focuses on deconfliction of activities, right? So reducing conflict in space. And it has elements of orbital debris cleanup and spacecraft disposal. So each one of these plays into some important elements of how we live, work, and operate in outer space. Now, not all of this is new stuff, right? There are about half of these are actually just elucidating old concepts that came out in Outer Space Treaty of 1967. In fact, the very first thing that Outer Space Treaty of 1967 does is it establishes that humankind is supposed to go into space for peaceful purposes, right? That is the ultimate reason for the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 to exist. And mostly the reason Outer Space Treaty of 1967 exists was to keep the United States and the Soviet Union from going to war in outer space, which would kill all of humanity. That was kind of the goal. They ask for transparency. This is also in Outer Space Treaty of 1967 for exactly the same reason as peaceful purposes, so that we're not, secretly putting weapons in space, and that we're being pretty clear about what we're doing up there. Outer Space Treaty of 67 and Artemis Accords both deal with emergency assistance. This is probably the big one that everyone agrees on. This is one of the most clear elements of space law and space custom, right? This is built on, we want to save people. We want to be, human, pro-human in outer space. So if there's an emergency in space, we want to render assistance. We're supposed to register our space objects. This is from Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and it's just reemphasized. There's actually the liability and registration conventions, right? Registration's been a pretty big issue in space law, although the way that we have enacted it has never exactly been what the original, the original way to enact it was. So your mileage may vary with registration. And there's also supposed to be the sharing of scientific data. That's kind of at the core of, again, being clear about what's going on in space. If we find that there is a major problem in outer space, we should, share that with others. But for me, what's a little bit more interesting are the new ideas that come in with the Accords. The idea of interoperability, I think, is a really smart idea that to make living and working in outer space a much more practical thing, right? All of our stuff should match up. We should be able to dock with, be able to mate with, right? Exchange equipment with, right? Based on universal standards, basically everything else that's up there, that's out in space and on celestial bodies. I think that makes a lot of sense, right? That kind of gets over the charger plug issue, like we still have here on Earth, right? One standard of physical technologies. Everything uses a USB drive. Something similar, but for spaceships. Protecting heritage is a new addition, right? There's been a pretty big push within the current U.S. administration to really protect the history of ourselves in space, like on space, essentially make the places we've landed or important objects in outer space protected as part of our common heritage, much the same way we protect buildings or natural features. And then as we move forward into space, that we can protect this heritage that we're creating as we move along. The big new idea is that we can that there are ways to use and profit from space resources. Again, it's not very clear in the Artemis Accords how this would work, but it's a movement towards building some sort of resource institution for monitoring and sharing resources and profiting from that in outer space. Another big idea is the deconfliction of activities, that all the activities that do occur in space should be done in such a way as to not cause conflict. This kind of comes in with the idea of safety zones or zones of exclusion around activity. But that's, again, not very well clarified within the Accords. And of course, orbital debris and spacecraft disposal is a new idea. There wasn't much orbital debris in 1967 to really be concerned with. Now there's a lot. Although I do think it's interesting that they talk about spacecraft disposal when in reality, we need to be getting away from having disposable spacecraft. But that's neither here. Well, that is very much here and now, but NASA, right? Okay, so there are some problems with these Accords. Ultimately, the Accords are meant to be enacted in cislunar space, which is a fairly limited region of activity, although the notion would be that if this works out in cislunar space, it could be expanded beyond that. What I think is a bigger problem is that it relies very much on customary law. You have to choose to adopt this and use it as your custom of how you're going to be operating in space. So unless you buy into it, it doesn't really count. Additionally, those 10 principles that I read, they're not very well elucidated on. They're kept pretty vague. Which is intentional in the way that they want people to, right? They want operators in space to be able to have some flexibility with them. Ultimately, there's no enforcement mechanism. It's just we agree to do these things. There's no one to say you agreed to do these things. And there's no way to really hold people to the agreement. And it is very heavily focused on national actors, right? It focuses on a model of space activity where the nation state and national space programs are at the core. And for a variety of reasons, I don't think that's the future. I don't think that's the present. but it's based on this old treaty, nation-state treaty model, as opposed to being much more multi-stakeholder in nature. And only 8 nations have signed this as of right now, and the two biggest players, apart from the United States, aren't going to sign it. So these are kind of a moot point in some ways, but they can still be useful to us. Now, they have not been widely adopted by spacefaring nations yet. That doesn't mean it might not happen. If Artemis Accords end up being pretty successful in cislunar space, we might see Russia or China join in. But at the end of the day, right, this still has what I call the UNCLOS problem, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas problem, when it comes to space resources. That being that it took 15 years to write the UNCLOS documents. And they're still, right, so it's a long process, and the payoff has been very minimal. In fact, there's really not a lot of deep space. There's not a lot of deep sea mining going on. In fact, I don't think there's any. There might be a little bit, but it's not occurring right now, and UNCLOS really hasn't helped spur that along. So if we want to be doing things in outer space, we need to be thinking about governance structures now. And that's going to be kind of the big point I'm going to be making today. So what are the opportunities for Mars that are laid out by the Artemis Accords? Well, the Artemis Accords do show that there is some negotiability in international treaties and in international customary law about how we operate in space. Basically, what it means is that we can change the rules about space. We can always change the rules, but right, this is kind of our first step showing that we're willing to do that we're thinking about making a better set of space law. The other good thing it does is it does give some pretty good general principles for future activities in space. It provides a bit of a wider framework for human space activities, right? Bill Lewis asked, doesn't OST specify that celestial resources may not be sold for profit? Pretty much. And Moon Treaty of 1979 tried to make some changes to that, but no real spacefaring nation ever did anything there. So yeah, right, the Artemis Accords are attempting to open that up just a little bit. Particularly, right, it's focused on this notion of resource utilization in space and the potential for some incentive structures, right, some profit structures in outer space. Also, one thing that I think that was interesting, and Director Bridenstine mentioned this earlier, they intentionally de-emphasize the notion of planetary protection, right? That is very much part of this, right? At least for other planets or celestial bodies, right? That we can go there is basically what it's trying to make legal by de-emphasizing the notion of planetary protection. I think he was very right when he said that internationally, legally, if you were to look at planetary protection, that means humans can't go anywhere. And as we all know, that's not what we're aiming for here. So Artemis Accords do I think, big step towards rolling that back a little bit. But at the end of the day, Outer Space Treaty of 67 still is the thing that reigns in the international sphere, creating some significant problems when it comes to actually landing on Mars. And I do bring those up in my book, Always Be Pitching. All right. So let's get to the second part of this, when we're talking about building a Martian constitution. Now, I am going to be explicitly saying, yes, we should. I'm talking about an independent political entity of Mars. Like, not even going to equivocate with that. I'm saying it right now, exactly that. Particularly because I believe that outer space treaty issues make it so hard to actually go to Mars. The only way we can get around it is to make Mars a political entity of its own. Also, independence from Mars seems to be the strongest way to secure a future for humans on Mars. But even if we're not going to be dealing with independence, right, we're still going to need institutions of governance on Mars. So, but I'm just being clear that yes, I am going to, if you want, we can have that argument about independence for Mars. But either way, we still need to talk about institutions of governance. Now, this is going to be hard, right? Building institutions of governments is very difficult, especially if we're going to be talking about a large-scale, internationalized, not state-sponsored activity of going to Mars and trying to govern it. Like, this is going to be difficult. It's going to require a lot of deep thought on what this means, how to build a best practice constitution when we really don't know what the situation on the ground is going to be. And it's going to require a lot of negotiation beforehand, and trying to figure out who the primary players in that is going to be part of the negotiation itself. So this is going to require, I think, a lot of rethinking about our big assumptions about current manned space activities. Mostly, we're going to have to put away the notion that manned space activities are conducted by nation states, and that the nation states of this world are going to be the ones primarily influencing building on Mars. They might be able to play a role later down the road, but I don't think that they're going to be the ones in the initial stages. I just don't think there's the societal buy-in within manned space faring countries to do this. I think we almost essentially have to build a audience, not just an audience, but a citizenry of Mars right off the bat. KSR plays a big role in a lot of this stuff that I am going to be doing. Aaron, I'll get to that in just a sec. Right, so here are the things that, and this is where the political science stuff comes back in. Here are the sorts of things that a Martian constitution is going to have to consider, right? It's going to need kind of the standard governmental institution considerations. It's going to need someone to make laws. It's going to need someone to put laws into force. So that's your legislature, your executive. It's going to need someone or some sort of function to make sure that justice is done. It's going to need to provide citizen rights. And this might be more than just life, liberty, and property. This might also be, right, we could have the discussion about this, right? Guaranteed air, guaranteed access to water, those sorts of things that might have to be built into here. You need some sort of economic and financial or banking institution. You need some way to deal with external politics, meaning dealing with other entities. And I think that's where we're going to get into the interesting stuff there, Aaron. You're going to need flexibility. Well, there's questions about whether you need flexibility or rigidity in your constitutions. Do you need a lot more flexibility because we don't know what's going to happen? Or do we need a set plan and to stick to it for developmental reasons, right? I do think that when we build a Martian constitution and build Martian political and governmental institutions, this is going to be based on this is going to be based on both economic development and planetary development, right? The terraforming project. I think you have to build the terraforming project into your constitution from the beginning. We can talk about that as well. But you also need to have a way to account for changes over time, right? Political situations change, and if at all possible, you should be able to deal with those changes within the guises of your political institutions, the Constitution. There's also certain political issues that I think we can see coming, right? The foreseeable political issues we're going to have. In fact, Aaron just asked that question: how would you handle dual citizenship, or those that only live there part of the year? I think the bigger question is those that want to live there forever, right? The settlers versus those that are coming for a few years to do some building work, make a lot of money, and go home. That's going to be a major political economic issue there. Greens versus red, right? Going back to Ken Stanley Robinson, right? Those that want to make Mars a livable planet versus those who like to keep Mars the way they are. And ultimately, if you don't build it in from the beginning, there is going to be an independent struggle. There is going to be a drive for Mars to become independent somewhere along the line. So that's something that I think you should begin from the beginning. So timing on this, right? I deeply believe this is something we need to consider before the first humans arrive, before the first humans leave for Mars, because we might actually need that to get around OST issues. Additionally, a Martian constitution would be there to set the rules for human activities, right? To help give us guidelines about what activities are considered to be acceptable on Mars and how we should approach them. And the way that I actually propose to do this is with a government in exile approach. Start not just the conversation, but actually building the institutions now. And then you can essentially set up a government in exile to deal with this, right? Knowing that you would want to, well, theoretically, that you would want to declare independence from the moment you land, you're going to need political independence. So the way this could work, right? It could work via public-private partnerships, which is going to be probably necessary for economic, just for the simple funding of the thing. We could get into the notion of settlement corporation or corporations, but I don't, that leads into everyone being the slaves for Weyland-Yutani or something along those lines. And let's just, that automatically kind of gives me the creeps, but at the same time, might be the best way to deal with this. Right, is to set up, right, essentially a corporate charter. East India Tea Company is kind of an example of how that could work there, or like the Pilgrims charters or things like that, right? A chartered corporation. And the way to really solidify this, I think, would be to have something like a Mars Institute on Earth that basically is modeled off of the way that the American Institute in Taiwan functions. It functions as a non-governmental representative entity between Mars and the governments of Earth that allows for a little bit of separation there. But ultimately, I think this needs to be taken seriously now if we're going to think about building a civilization on Mars starting in the next decade. There's a lot to unpack here, and I think this conversation needs to happen now, especially if like 4 years, inside of a decade, we're putting boots on the ground. We need to have this discussion now. So this leads to some conclusions and future steps we need to take. So from conclusion side of things, Artemis Accords are nice. They're a nice add-on, a nice DLC pack for Outer Space Treaty of '67, but they have significant limitations. Mostly the problem is that it leans extraordinarily heavily on Outer Space Treaty of '67 and doesn't really go so far as saying, hey, here are the big problems that we're actually trying to fix. It's still really vague. The entire Accords fit on a PowerPoint presentation. I highly recommend going and looking at it. You can just Google Artemis Accords and see the problems there. Honestly, I do think we probably need to find a path outside of the traditional international legal framework, being OST 67, in order to settle Mars. I do think that the way that we wrote Outer Space Treaty 67, 53 years ago, really makes it hard to settle Mars from a legal perspective. And we're going to have to think about a way to get around that. And we need to think about not only the way to get around the legal structures, we need to think about the legal structures we want to put into place on Mars now, so that when we can so that eventually, right, Mars can be a signatory towards whatever the new legal structure happens to be, and they can have a say in making that happen. And ultimately, the thing I would suggest, I know this is a very STEM-heavy audience, and I'd like to remind you that government itself is a technology, right? It is something that needs development. It is something we need to think about. It is a technology that needs development for the particular purpose of going to Mars and staying there, not just going for a little sortie mission, but actually building a second instance of humanity on Mars. So that's right. That's kind of what I've got there. Those are the big points there. So I do just want to thank you. If you want more on this, I do get into a lot more of this stuff within my book, Space Civilization. That way. It is available from Lexington Press. It is on Amazon. The link has been shared above. We've got a few, we've got about 7 minutes for questions. So I'm going to start going through the chat and addressing questions, because there's also some really great juicy questions along the way. So like I said, Outer Space Treaty has some iffy. All right, so doesn't Outer Space Treaty specify that celestial resources may not be sold for profit? Not really, as Aaron said, but it has to be for the benefit and interest of all countries. Yeah, Article 1 does that, but it makes it really difficult because they've never set up an institution to actually distribute and deal with the resource question. The Moon Treaty specifically had an article that was meant to do that, but they ended up kicking the can down the road for that. Plus, the United States, Russia, and China never signed it. So who cares? Is planetary protection a law or just a NASA guideline? It is a law. It is a law that is in Outer Space Treaty of '67. The United States, as a signatory of Outer Space Treaty in 1967, makes this U.S. law. So there we go. Agree with independence? Yes. Kim Stanley Robinson elaborated on some of what a new Martian constitution could look like in Mars Trilogy. Yeah, the Mars Trilogy really was in kind of the background of a lot of the work on this, especially the preparatory seminar that I had when I was in the early stages of thinking about maybe writing the book. So yeah, KSR is definitely in there. Won't the independence of Mars require an independence from Earth for resources? No, right? There are plenty of independent nations on this Earth that still trade with other nations for resources. Political independence and economic independence, two separate things. That's when I talked about the Mars Institute on Earth or the settlement corporations, or however we build that institution. I don't have the institution in my mind, but I think the way that it could work would be to have an institution here on Earth that's essentially an embassy, right? That make sure that the trade between Earth and Mars flows, right? The goods must flow. So independent and political, right? Political independence and not economic independence. Political independence, economic independence, and resource independence are three separate things. I don't have a third hand. Three separate things. And I'm advocating for political independence because I think that's really a huge, right? I think that could potentially be a civilization ending problem if Earth and Mars ever decide to fight about it. So do it from the beginning. How would you handle dual citizenship for those that live there only part of the year? From the dual citizenship perspective, I think you could legitimately be a Martian citizen and someone else's citizen, much the same way that you can be a dual citizen, right? I view Mars as a nation unto itself, right? It could be set up as its own nation. Those that live there only part of the year, I think that's the more problem there. I think that ends up being the problem. Yeah. As long as no Martian has agreed to the OSD framework, that's the way you get around it. Exactly there. All right. What do you think of Dennis Hope's lunar embassy? I don't know anything about that. Is this a foot race with China to see who gets their government of choice on Mars? I don't think so. I don't think China. I mean, I'm not 100% on where China stands with their ability to put boots on Mars, but I do think that I do think it's not going to be a nation that puts people on Mars. You're not going to be wearing inherently a national flag on your shoulder when people get to Mars. I think it's going to be a multi-stakeholder sort of mission. But I do think there might be some friction between national governments and in those nations, including an independent Mars. Which is why I think it needs to happen quickly. I think it needs to happen initially and be very clear upfront about what's happening. But ultimately, China, Russia, or even the United States getting to Mars, as opposed to an independent Mars, could be a problem. I do also get into this in the book when I talk about astropolitics in some bit. Indentured servitude, I definitely have thought about that. It's weighed on my mind a whole lot. With the Martian Constitution, right? On the one hand, it might be the best way to get people onto Mars. Indentured servitude is not necessarily a bad idea if you find a way to, find a way for it to not be exploitational. I do think that's something that's worth exploring more. How do we make a Mars government happen? That's the big question. I think that we need that the major stakeholders in this, I think there essentially needs to be a Martian constitutional convention. I think someone needs to stake a Martian constitutional convention, monetarily, actually get the people that are interested in this, put your money where your mouth is, and people putting their mouths where their money is as well for this. Prime purpose of Hope Galactic Government is the independent regime of the institution. Don't see a question there. Eventually, there will be a split between Martian settlements. I prefer the word settlement over to colony because colony means that it's part of another instance, whereas settlement is like this is its own instance. I think there's going to be an issue there. How will a Martian nation deal with Earth-run colonies that are on Mars? I don't think there needs to be Earth-run colonies on Mars. Mars is for Martians. But I think that needs to be very clear that if you go to Mars, you're not you have to deal with the Martian thing. I do think that there might be something about Mars Constitution as an overriding umbrella constitution with a whole lot of federalism baked in. I think that needs thinking. The U.S. use the economic power to drive political change. How do you isolate Mars from that? That's a good question. Can we have a quantum computer be our Mars government? Some things to think about there. Thank you for ordering the book. Thank you all for the talk. How can we start conversation work on the issue? It's a lot to do, but nothing was done yet. Exactly. I think that's the problem. Maybe today, right here, is what we're doing. Maybe the little Discord server that I have invited people to. I can throw the link in as well. The Discord server for this, not to Carol Parsons. It's going to go to everyone. Maybe that Discord server is where we actually start continuing this conversation. I think this conversation is the start of the conversation. How lengthy do I cover Mars in my book?
Let me just cut in here real quick, because it is a cutoff time for the next session. Now, this room is open for another 15 minutes if you want to continue the discussion, or if we move it to the Discord server. I think there has been a bit of a call to action in several sessions with this conference, and I think we should potentially discuss that more. But if people want to go to the next session, those are starting now.
Yes, absolutely.
However, this will continue to be open for the next 15 minutes until the next session has to start. And we have to start preparing for that. So if people want to stick around and continue talking, that is totally okay. I just want to give everybody that warning now. You need to go if you want to go to the next session.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
I'll take it back to you for now. I'll stick around until, well, I have to run the next session too. So I'll be here for as long as needed.
All right. All right. So how lengthy do I cover Mars in my book? The entire book is predicated on Mars as the instance of space civilization, but I am looking at larger things we can be talking about. Again, this is a book about questions. I don't have a lot of answers in here, right? As we're seeing, right, we need to have the conversations, right? These things need to be taken care of. I can't do this as one person. I think that's one of the very first things I say in the book. I can't just do it all on my own, and I don't want to do it on my own. I never trust a political scientist to work on their own. The last time a political scientist basically tried to make a big change all on their own was Woodrow Wilson, and that didn't turn out super great. So that's one of the big things that I do there. According to Amazon, my book is for sale for $95. Yeah, it is a hardcover academic book, but if there is interest for it, there might be further printings that might make it cheaper. There is if you buy it from Lexington Press today, no, for the next couple of months, there is a code, an author's code that you can buy it for cheaper. So there's I'm trying to find the code here. Let me see if I can get it pulled up. But there is an author's code that if you buy it from the publisher themselves, it's a 30% off code, which is nice. Let me see if I can pull it up. I meant to have it pulled up before here. All right. That'd be Roman. It is great to see so many people dropping into the Space Civilization Discord. I really appreciate that. And I will make sure that I know in the conference app, I will put the link to it. I will get it pulled up as soon as this session is over. I promise you. But the book, it's out. I will appreciate anyone who wants to read it. And I really appreciate all of you that are going to be joining, that are currently joining into the Space Civilization Discord. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Are there any other questions? We can turn it over to the next presenter, but thank you all very much for coming today. I really appreciate each and every one of you that was here. Great questions, all of you. How do I, the one that I'm coming back to, US uses economic power to drive political change. How do you isolate Mars from that? That's a really good question. Do you have any conversation about it with people in government or your colleagues in other countries? Not right now. No, this is kind of the beginning of, I had a small think tank that kind of fell apart where we were talking about this. I have a few colleagues. Lex 30 off 20. Yes, that is my discount code. Thank you, Chris. That is the one. That's the discount code. I don't know. Couldn't find it. I don't know where you found it, but thank you. There it is. I would love to have more conversations with colleagues in other countries. That the Discord server is meant for that. I would love to keep having that conversation with y'all. People in government doesn't really want to hear it. And I've also approached, in some ways, some of the other stakeholders. I've approached. The one problem that I've really run into is that a lot of the STEM practitioners in this, the engineers, the scientists, well, government doesn't care about it because there's no political audience, really, because we haven't pushed forth that. And then the science people don't want to really do this because they don't. They think that the tech stuff's what matters. The thing that really kickstarted this whole research agenda for me, this whole conversation for me, is the thing that kept me up at night is how do you. Right. The reason why a Mars settlement is going to fail isn't because the technology breaks, it's because someone's going to go blow all the airlocks. For me, and then how do you prevent that? You're looking for the right institutions within your PhD, however, is the field of law rather than politics. Yeah, right. It's mostly been, the time, right? The time window, has massively crunched, and I think the tech is rapidly taking off because the people who have the money to invest in it are doing it. Now, when it comes to the political side of things, like the people with the money don't invest in it because they don't particularly care. And that's not a bad thing, right? They need to focus on the tech stuff. But those of us that are in law and politics, right, and sociology and all of these different fields, right, we need to do the things we can do. They're talking about sending a poet. No one said anything about sending a lawyer. No one said anything thing about sending a politician, although politicians can emerge on their own. I totally get not wanting to send lawyers and politicians, but at the end of the day, we're going to need that. So there we go. Yeah, I think those are where we need to head. Yeah. No, Mayday, I totally agree. I start off in the politics. The government in exile, I think, is the way to do it, right? You build it now and put it into places you get there, right? And I think you operate government in exile within some sort of right. At the end of the day, we're going to need some sort of colonial corporation or settlement corporation. I know that's a scary concept. Sci-fi has made that a scary concept, and we've seen, right, corporations do terrible things, but but they are also capable of doing big things. And there's going to have to be some sort of, right, settler selection process. That, right, Mars is going to need people, and we're going to have to find some way to build them. And I think there is a difference between astronauts and settlers, which I get into. So I think that's something we need to think about. And I do think we need to find some way of establishing these institutions and being clear about what we're going to do beforehand. And I think you can do it essentially as a government in exile. It's worked in the past for essentially revolutionary groups going to retake their countries. That's kind of what we're doing, right? We are the revolutionary group seeking to retake and make an independent Mars in some ways. And perhaps we're fighting against the Russians and the Chinese and maybe the Americans. I don't know. But I do think that's kind of where we're headed with this. But that's the only clear way forward I think we have. We can't change space law in enough time to actually get there in a decent manner. So we have to just be clear. We're going to scrap space law. We're going to be independent. We're not going to sign OST until y'all rewrite the damn thing and make it better. So I think that's where we're going. So I think that's pretty much going to wrap it up. If there are any other questions, put them in the Discord. I'm going to link it again, and we can talk there. I really appreciate all of you. So thank you all very much. And I think we're going to turn it over there. I'm going to head over to Discord if y'all got things there. So thank you all very much.
I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting and then just basically start up the next one in another 10 minutes or so. But thank you for your time. This is a very interesting discussion. I'll leave this up for another couple minutes, so anybody who doesn't want to or hasn't yet can go over to the Discord to get that link.
Yeah, and I'm gonna link it in the on the conference, the Attendify app. I'm gonna go ahead and link the Discord there as well. So that should be a way to find it. Thank you all very much.
All right, thanks. Have a good rest of the conference.
You too.